Uh, okay, hello everybody. I'm Jake Bartholomew with the Radical Philosophy Hour. We're here with a special version of the Radical Philosophy Hour, where we have pre-recorded this discussion on this new volume, The Marcusean Mind. As I said, uh, well, I didn't say it. I said it in a previous recording. Shh. Um, but a great new volume came out this year. 500 pages. I went through the whole thing. It's very fantastic. So. I am here with the editors of this volume, uh, Eduardo Altheman Santos, a postdoctoral researcher and team member of the Kete Hamburger Center for Apocalyptic and Post-Apocalyptic Studies at Heidelberg University, Jina Fast, who is the Shift Assistant Professor of Applied Ethics of the Common Good and director of the Learning Collaboratives at Hampshire College, who holds a PhD in philosophy and women's and gender studies from Temple University, Nicole Mayberry, an assistant research professor at Arizona State University, and Sid Simpson, assistant professor of politics at the University of the South, where he teaches late modern and contemporary political thought, continental philosophy, and critical theory. So I would like to welcome you here for a discussion. First thing, obviously, this is quite an undertaking, as I said, a major volume, covering basically every facet of Marcuse's thought that you could imagine. Um, and obviously, many people would say, especially in contemporary critical theory, whatever we want to call it, that the age of the new left is far over, right? Back in the haze of the 70s. So, I mean, I'm sure some people think, why Marcuse now, right? What is the continued relevance of his thought for the present? Why do we turn to him, and why do we have so much to say about him? So I'd leave it to any of you who would like to begin to perhaps ferment an answer to address this question.
Well, I think, thank you so much for that intro, Jake. It's a pleasure to be here. I, the way I would respond to that is we undertook this project, starting a few years ago. I think most folks in the academic community know that putting out any kind of volume or book is kind of like Hollywood. By the time you're actually sort of on the press circuit talking about it, you shot it years prior. And so it's really interesting in that I actually think when we started the project, we felt so compelled because it felt like there were sort of these boiling or maybe sort of overboiling conditions in the world that made us feel like it was really time to revisit Marcuse then. And now in 2025, when we are recording this podcast, when the book is actually out, I feel like, the parallels of when Marcuse was writing and when the New Left was sort of thinking about sort of the rise of fascism and authoritarianism in Europe feels even closer to home for many of us than it did even a couple of years ago. And so for me, I think there's certainly this gravitation when things are difficult to start looking backwards, to look at history, to find the parallels, to not only kind of explain circumstances, but I think really also make sense from a personal level of the emotions of what it's like to live through really challenging times. We look to art, we look to film, we look to literature to kind of tell us what were people experiencing, how were they thinking about that. Because when something is no longer history, it's right in your present. I think there's this sort of natural gravitation to try to make sense of that through the voices of others. And so for me, I feel like, we started this project a few years back thinking, wow, shit is difficult. Things are on fire. And now when it's published, I personally feel like there's even more relevance because I certainly am looking back to folks in the Frankfurt School and Marcuse and others because I live in Washington, D.C., and, the fascism is right here in my backyard now. But that's sort of how I think about it. But I would love to hear from everybody else because we've been on this for quite some time with one another.
Yeah, I think that for me, regardless of how we feel about the new left, like just what's going on in Marcuse's work feels really useful and relevant, and like the conditions rhyme. Like not even like setting aside just the student movements of the last couple of years vis-a-vis the student movements of '68, just like the critical resources in Marcuse feel so contemporary. Like the collaboration between liberal capitalism and fascism seems to be hitting us over the head. Our continuing struggle to form class consciousness seems really important, and he gives us some resources to think through that. one-dimensionality of discourses, both domestic and international. I feel like every time I try to have a conversation about Palestine, I just want to be like, there's this really cool thinker that helps us to like get a grip on this. Same thing with repressive tolerance. His writing about the fetishization of instrumental rationality, whether that's through like consulting, which all my students seem to want to do, or if we want to talk about like why Palantir and why like tech futures are so important right now. It just like he gives us so much to think through things that feel very specifically 21st century, despite the fact that he was writing so long ago. I just like he's got so much to give us, and I feel like there's more to do.
Right. I agree with everything that Nicole and Sid have mentioned. And I would add to this a question that often arises when I'm talking about Marcuse in international and local communities is this question of why Marcuse? You know, why do we engage Marcuse when we could just read Angela Davis or Ruth Wilson Gilmore or Catherine McKittrick or Sylvia Winter? You know, why Marcuse? And I think that part of it is thinking about where we can build collaboration with theorists, both historical and contemporarily, because in the left movements that I'm a part of that are often queer, that are centered on disability, that are feminist, that are considering, you know, the fact that we're living in the Anthropocene, that are centered in indigenous reclaiming of land and histories. You know, there's this debate of whether or not we should engage with, you know, with generally old white theorists and whether we want to build movements with white leftists or if we want to, you know, build future worlds together apart from that. And I think Marcuse and engaging with Marcuse's work, both in terms of what he inspired and in terms of activism, but also kind of the theoretical importance of engaging with Freud and Marx and Hegel become really important to the contemporary movement building and collaboration across different modalities and experiences.
Yeah, first of all, thanks a lot, Jake, for having us here. It's a pleasure to be here. It's great to meet you all again, Sid, Jina, Nicole. It's been a while, so it's great to see you. I second all of that, and there's this interesting conversation that was published. I think it's one of the texts that came out in the edition that was made for the 1974 Van Zandt lectures of Marcuse. And there's this conversation between Detlef Clausen and Angela Davis, and they're addressing exactly this issue in the early 2000s, I would say, or mid 2000s. And they're saying, why are we reading Marcuse again? And they're saying, well, I think Angela Davis just replies, well, it seems to be even more actual and relevant today than back in the 60s, to be honest. So if we take some of Marcuse's key topics, so the idea that fascism could linger on after fascism was militarily defeated, the idea of a global counter-revolution starting in the 70s that, you know, was going to try to preemptive just stifle any kind of revolutionary concern or movement. This idea of Sid mentioned of this technological rationality that is spreading as if it were neutral, as if it were immediately beneficial to everyone and equally beneficial to everyone. The concern with nature, the destruction of nature, the relationship between nature and human beings, and I just see this all around us again. I think these are still some of the main questions we're trying to address in our practices, in our theories, and so on and so forth. So it's also interesting. In the last 50 years that of Marcuse reception, there were always these attempts to look at his writings and say, oh, so in this excerpt, he's actually talking about the atom bomb and the atom threat, and that's not really a reality anymore, but we can adapt that to, I don't know, ecological concerns and so on and so forth. And you open the newspaper today and it's back in the agenda. We're really talking about atom bombs just being shot out of missiles from the ocean by submarines and so on and so forth. So I think the topics are still here, you know, whether or not, and I think this is also an angle that we were aiming for when doing the Marcusean Mind was we don't want to look back to Marcuse with nostalgia. I think this is something we discussed a lot among us. And I remember Sid saying, like, we don't want to write a hagiography of Marcuse. That's not what we're here for. But I still think the topics are worth revisiting, and the method is still there.
Fantastic. So it's interesting, all the points that you all made, in the sense that it brings me then to the next point that I wanted to point to actually, which is, there's a massive array of contributors, right? We also obviously have, major Marcuse scholars like Douglas Kellner, but we have scholars from at least three continents. Many, not just European or North American, but many from Latin America. And in fact, the afterword by Douglas Kellner is called the Global Marcuse. And I do think, right, so the criticism has been leveled, against the Frankfurt School and critical theory in general, that they ignore the rest of the world, right? That they're Eurocentered and all of the rest. And I think, interestingly, this volume has this massive scope and these ties and they're not just ties of fidelity, right? Actually, where you have contributors from Latin America, but they're talking about Marcuse and they're talking about him, say, geared towards a North American audience as well. They're dealing with local problems, right? And so I think perhaps we could talk about sort of the array of contributors and the critical engagements that I think are especially unique, especially in the case of Brazil, not to mention the rest of Latin America, but especially Brazil, these links of international contributors. So if you could all perhaps talk about the scope of your contributors, how you got them, and sort of why or how this scope of contributors internationally is important as well for Marcuse.
Guess I can start with this one since I'm the Brazilian representative. I'm repping Brazil here. Yeah. So I think for quite some time now, if you go to one of the International Herbert Marcuse conferences, which take place every 2 years, I think the Brazilian delegation is always one of the biggest ones. So Brazilian scholars and activists have engaged with Marcuse closely for quite some time now. I would say since the 60s. The first time One Dimensional Man was published in Brazil was still during the military dictatorship under censorship, and they had to change the title of it and use the subtitle to bypass the censorship, which was great because censors are usually really, really stupid and they didn't notice that. So they were able to get the book circulating in Brazil still while the military dictatorship was in power, and they have been actively engaging it with Marcuse's framework for quite some time now. And as you said, Jake, we were always trying to address local issues and mix it up with our autochthonous traditions and forms of thinking and so on and so forth. But sadly, I think a lot of people were being left out of some conversations in critical theory as a whole. I think the Marcusean audience is a little more inclusive than other critical theory audiences. That's my impression. I don't know what Sid, Gina, and Nicole think about this, how they see this, but still, it was still centered on the same people as usual. It was still including the same people as usual, and not to badmouth anyone. I think there's been great work that has been done on Marcuse from Europe, from North America, and so on and so forth. I admire a lot of these people, but it always felt to us that some people were left out and should be included in this conversation. And I think that was also a concern that we had from the get-go with this project. Like, we wanted to really make this as inclusive as possible in terms of critical theory. I don't know what the others think, but yeah.
I think I would absolutely echo what Eduardo has already said. I would add that there were a couple of other layers to this as well, Jake. The four of us together, I think all kind of have our respective degrees to which we actually engage with critical theory, or if that's sort of part of our even our sort of academic homes. We, I think, really boast an interdisciplinary team in terms of our perspectives and sort of how we're approaching or how we were approaching this volume just based off of either our pedagogy or our training. I mean, I, for one, think there's a kind of delicate irony that I'm on two Marcuse projects, although I would never say that I'm actually a full Marcuse sort of acolyte. But I kind of boast, I do cultural geography. And so to Eduardo's point and to yours about like this intentionality behind getting folks and really contextualizing the conversation of Marcuse where they're at locally, I think is fundamental. As a geographer, as a cultural geographer, I really think that, place absolutely informs perspective, and that perspective of experience has to be forefronted in how we think and write and discuss topics. And I also, to the point about relevancy, like why Marcuse now, I think that's absolutely how you keep someone like him or others in the Frankfurt School alive, is you put them in place. The other part of this is that we were also really intentional, in addition to having representation of contributors. I think the last time I counted, it was 15 countries, and as you noted, a few continents, is that we were really intentional in our call about engaging not only the folks that are absolutely essential to the Marcuse community, like Doug and others, but really being intentional that our call was to uplift and ensure that folks who maybe are non-tenured or early career or graduate students also had a voice. Because I think in addition to embracing sort of a multinational and interdisciplinary collaboration on Marcuse, it's also really essential that if we get the opportunity, which we did, and I was really thrilled like that we got this contract, like if we get to be here and do this, then we absolutely have to bring others forward. And that might look sort of like multilinguistic, multinational, but I think it's also about ensuring that we can kind of build bridges or help other folks get in. I know that I was really excited that like a lot of folks, this is one of their first publications that's actually been peer reviewed and is out there. And so I think it's also about making space and intentionality in the way that if you get these contracts and you get to bring as many people as you can, and like, thanks, shout out to Routledge for letting us, have like a 500-page, 40 chapter, whatnot volume. I think it's also, there was also an intentionality on the behalf of the team to make sure that a multidisciplinary, interdisciplinary sort of perspective was part of the volume, but also ensuring that the voices were also representative of sort of people at different stages in their career or thought, who may or may not actually even be embedded in the academy. I think we have a couple of sort of folks that are just independent researchers and scholars. And so I don't know if I took us off track there, but I just would say like that is absolutely an intentional part of this volume as well.
Great. And actually perfect, because we can then integrate this to have you, Sid, and Eugenia, if you want to respond. You did mention non-traditional scholars. I also saw a lot of collaboration, right? And I think this is very clear. Traditionally, philosophy written by one person, usually texts written by one person, but especially I think there's an activist tinge and the recognition that our specialties are different. You mentioned cultural geography, right? We all have our different specialties, and I think especially this sort of collaborative aspect of it is incredibly unique among these sorts of volumes. So if we can tie that question in then to what I said earlier, if you or Sid and Gina want to also address that question, that would be fantastic.
Yeah, sure. I can take this. I can take the first stab at it. Because as Nicole was speaking, I was thinking a lot about philosophy as the philosopher on our editor team, and the way that Marcuse is treated as a philosopher, and the way that I first came to his work was very much through studying Freud and Hegel and Marx, and reading Marcuse with Adorno and Horkheimer, and thinking about social and political philosophy. And what was really interesting at APA, American Philosophical Association meetings, yearly meetings, was the work that was coming out of like what we called like the B squad, like out of the folks that work in Africana and Caribbean philosophy, or that do work in creolization, and feminist theory and queer theory and philosophy. And so I saw this volume as an opportunity for us to engage in inter, multi, and transdisciplinary work that was, in fact, bringing philosophy more into a public space of practice instead of just being, abstract theorizing that occurs in in the mind or in the writing or in the endeavors of the individual scholar. And so I think that recognition, Jake, in what the value of this volume is that. And there's certainly an activist kind of bent to it, because I think as you move philosophy into the public space, into the political, in the place where I'd argue it's supposed to be to begin with, you have to engage with emplacement. You have to engage with history. You have to enter into like a trans or multi or interdisciplinary and analytic framework in order to do something really meaningful with, the theory and with the work of folks like Marcuse.
Yeah, I'll agree with all that. I think that I just to go back for just a second because I had this in my mind. I was like, I want to say this. It's like not just that we wanted to have as international a contributor pool as possible, but also just like it's literally true that Marcuse has been taken up and thought with by thinkers from all over the world, right? Like Bolivar Echeverria was thinking with Marcuse, and Enrique Dussel was thinking with Marcuse. It just like there's a way that we could have done this book in which those names would not have been present, or right, or would only have been present in a footnote or something like that. And I think that we were all really committed to thinking with as many people as possible and making sure that they were in there. And with respect to this being collaborative, like I both in terms of my feelings about Marcuse and my experiences with my colleagues, Marcuse has always just felt more collaborative. And I don't know if it's just like I'm projecting this or like vibing out on Marcuse being out there with the student movements or always thinking of him as like speaking with Angela Davis or out there in the crowds, talking to the students and stuff. But just like it, because he's so situated within a particular struggle, it felt to me as if he was writing things like an essay on liberation, like in conversation with other people who were doing the work in a way that I feel less like with other thinkers in the Frankfurt School, for instance. But also just like in my own experience, like I've been to a number of these Frankfurt School conferences, and the Marcuse people are different, right? Like I think that after having gone to the meeting of the Marcuse Society 2 years ago in Arizona, I just like immediately made a bunch of friends who I ended up editing a couple books with, and I'm really like grateful for that. And that's just been an experience that like did not happen when I was speaking to the Adorno people. Like there's a certain kind of collaboration and commitment to actually going outside and not only touching grass, but like protesting and like doing things with what we're talking about that seems to be left out with other kinds of critical theory that I feel can get sort of lost in the weeds of aesthetics or navel gazing. So Marcuse, I just like feel like it's right there, and that I think that's partly because of his like topicality and contemporary interest, but also just like the kinds of people who find themselves drawn to him are kinds of people I find myself drawn to.
Perfect. And in fact, that is it's as if you planned it. Uh, a segue to talking about the specific parts of the text. Now, obviously, we can't cover everything, so I really sort of leaf through, and obviously, all of you have contributed to this, and so I wanted to talk about some of your respective contributions. One of the, of course, very topical things that is dealt with at length, and I think something that we've had to return to is repressive tolerance. Right, which as you pointed out, right, this was written years ago. We could not have envisioned how relevant this topic would become in the present, which is always, I wouldn't say a pleasant surprise. It's an unpleasant surprise, certainly. But I know, Gina, you have a contribution on repressive tolerance. And so I would like to offer you the opportunity to talk a little bit about your contribution and also sort of the section that deals largely with it.
Yeah, absolutely. When I was writing this, it was kind of just the beginnings of conservative activists starting to politicize, and not that it wasn't political, that it isn't social and political to begin with, but politicized in a way that bastardizes critical race theory. And so I was thinking quite a bit about the way in which on the right and the far right, there was the utilization of the term tolerance in a way that's pretty similar to the way in which moral objectivists in the history of philosophy use it. But again, because not everyone's philosophers, and because the study of philosophy and where the left and the right are in the discipline of philosophy is a bit different than where we are in the United States in terms of the left and the right and the center. But the thinking was to explicate this concept from Marcuse's work for a more general public and for especially our students. I think my orientation was always toward my students, for whom these kinds of volumes, as you're taking classes in philosophy or political theory or political science, can be really useful. And so really explicating this concept of repressive tolerance and how a term that we tend to take as like a central platitude or value of centrist democratic practice is really already embedded with a kind of conservatism, and where there's not attention to power paid in the traditional ways that we utilize the upholding of the value of tolerance. To tolerate isn't to say anything about the value of speech or the value of perspective or the value of humanity. It can become empty or it can be weaponized. And so I was inviting people to think with me about the various ways in which this occurs. And I think I very briefly ended the chapter with the example of critical race theory to kind of put into consideration the various ways in which education itself is full of, and the way that DEI historically has operated as a pretty liberal tradition and practice in the United States. We're not aiming for justice. We're not aiming for equity. We're not aiming for, reparative work or reconciliation. We're really just aiming for inclusion and belonging, which itself is a form of repressive tolerance and which is very much tied to political liberalism, which is internationally conservative, more on the right than on the left, as it is positioned in the United States. And then the last example was, it ended up being kind of a foreshadowing of where this concept was going to move next, which I didn't want it to be. I wanted it to be, a place and a space where we could start to kind of, heed that off, to cut it off and think together as those that identify as educators and more with leftist politics. But yeah, it ended up being kind of like a foreshadowing of where we were going.
Absolutely, yes. So much for the tolerant left, they say. I think a good piggyback on that, of course, is Eduardo, your chapter on fascism now and then, and again, we have to think now is a different now than it was written. But perhaps you could speak a bit about your contribution that sort of, slots in sort of at an angle with that, right? If you could, Eduardo.
Yes, absolutely. And this chapter is another example of what Nicole was mentioning in the beginning of the lag between the time you were writing this, the time it got published, and the time you were actually discussing the piece. Because when I wrote this, Biden was still in power in the US, and I finished the chapter talking about, imagine if Trump makes a comeback or something like that. And at the same time in Brazil, Bolsonaro was still in power and not Lula. So I was like immersed in this very necropolitical administration of Bolsonaro. And I really wanted to highlight how fascism was still very much alive in the world as a whole. And I think there's been quite a few misunderstandings about what fascism really means, and what does it mean to talk about fascism today. Because on the one hand, you don't want to overuse the word and then lead it to it's losing its meaning, like everyone just calling fascists and nowadays, which But then again, I was more concerned with the fact that we cannot call people fascists just because most of the times they're very blatantly fascists, you know? It's very hard not to see fascism in some of the things that have been going on in the world today. And I think there's this debate nowadays, like with Trump, with Bolsonaro, but a lot of people in the world. You can talk Viktor Orban in this, Duterte, that used to be a big example as well. Quite a global constellation of fascists going on in the world. And there's this big debate, I think, in the humanities, which was one of the most interesting one in the last few years, whether this phenomena was neoliberalism or was it fascism? And I think there was this either or kind of approach to this debate. So on the one side, everybody just jumping in and saying, no, 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 this is not the repetition of the 1930s. History does not repeat itself to the script and so on and so forth. This is a new thing. It's much more neoliberal and so on and so forth. And on the other hand, people were saying, no, 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 this is pretty much all the same elements of the 1930s. And it seemed to me that there was a middle ground or a dialectical way of putting it, which was saying it doesn't have to be either or, you know. History really does not repeat itself to the script, but some things, some structural elements of fascism are still very much alive. And this to me seemed like a very Marcusean insight in the sense that he was, you know, he fled Nazi Germany. He joined the Institute for Social Research just a few days or weeks before he had to flee to different parts of the world, in Switzerland, and before he eventually landed in the U.S. And when they spent all those years in the US, basically what Marcuse was doing, and the other critical theorists too were saying, listen, all the stuff that we saw happening in Weimar Republic that led us to fascism and Nazism there are still going on, are still alive, they're still here, and we need to deal with these issues before fascism re-erupts, as it does from time to time because we do not deal with the structural issues. So I wanted to jump in on that discussion and bring some ideas, some Marcusian insights that I think are helpful today. So for instance, I think it's pretty common if you go to one of these debates that people will say to you, but fascism was something that happened in Germany or in Italy or in Portugal for in the 1920s and 1930s, and then it was gone. And I think Marcuse provides us with a different kind of definition of fascism that is not so timely and chronologically and geographically situated, and that allows us to expand the definition of fascism to traits of personality, to problems with bourgeois democracy that doesn't address fundamental issues that eventually lead to the kind of resentment of mass resentment that builds the mass support for fascist leaders. Inequalities, soaring inequalities, the loss of control over some technological developments. So, for instance, in the 30s, the radio was this big thing about that used to be used to spread the word of fascism. Now we have social media, algorithms, and so on and so forth. So I really wanted to bring those elements back in the table for us to requalify the discussion on fascism and just say, hey, it doesn't have to be either or. We can have this kind of neoliberal fascism that's been going around for a few decades now.
Very good, and I think you're right. Neither nor. I mean, after all, we have to remember, right? What country had some of the first neoliberal reforms? Of course, it was Chile under Pinochet, right? Which precisely provides us with the model of exactly what that would be. And I would say we see similar things with the desires of the Thiels and the Curtis Yarvins of the world, where democratic control is an obstacle to increased growth. But that's neither here nor there. That's here for another intervention. But I think that's very insightful, and I think absolutely correct. And I see this as well. I think, sort of the more fascistic elements leading us as a decent enough, not great, segue towards Nicole's chapter, since I think the terrain for conflict that led us needing to return to repressive tolerance in the face of the far right has led, of course, to Dobbs and other. I mean, God knows what's the next Supreme Court judgment that we're looking at, right? But I think the big process of the last few years has been the increasing capture of institutions and dismantling of institutions, which of course ties into the neoliberalism. So, this is my jumping off point. Of course, you talk about what you prefer in your chapter, Nicole, but if you could talk about your chapter on Dobbs, that would be fantastic.
Sure. Thanks for that. I think both what Gina and Eduardo are raising is absolutely sort of kind of an entry point into sort of the spatial politics that I take up on my chapter. So in anything that I'm doing, I'm probably going to be talking about space and place, and then anti-blackness and white supremacy. So squeaky wheel in that sense, but I think it's also really important in the context of Marcuse, and actually think Marcuse provides us a really interesting lens to what Eduardo was saying, where he has sort of these not timeless, but I'll use timeless for sort of a lack of better term, that I think we can take up in spatial, in the context of space, these definitions that I think are really useful. And so for Marcuse, he, I think, provides a really interesting critique of, like, societies maintain domination precisely by tolerating certain forms of dissent, allowing enough of us to sort of feel free without ever disrupting the state of control. And in particular, my chapter takes this up in the conversation that feels so long ago, in the context of Roe v. Wade and the Dobbs decision, as you mentioned. And I think that what I try to bring up in the chapter, looking into sort of the spatial politics and bringing in a sort of anti-Black perspective, is that, Roe v. Wade and reproductive rights in the United States is a profoundly, I think, geographical conversation. And I think Roe, for me, was a sort of formed, a spatialized repressive tolerance that I talk about in the chapter, although I don't remember if I actually use that phrase. But essentially, we legalized reproductive rights and abortion nationally, but distributed the access to that unequally. And that, for me, was particularly at the fore as I talked about class and region, but particularly in the context of race and ethnicity. So, some women sort of gained mobility in the sense that they had reproductive freedoms, but others were immobilized. And I cite a lot of folks that have already made this argument, I think, well before I did, including Dorothy Roberts, among others, where it's like, this is something that we should have been talking about, but we weren't, because enough of us were free, enough white women, really is what I'm saying in the chapter, were free, or felt free enough with this that we didn't really have to protect it as much. And so the idea then that, Roe v. Wade could be overturned with the Dobbs decision came as a huge shock to many. But I think it ultimately provided a ripe opportunity finally for discussion where that sort of happy consciousness of freedom that a lot of us perceived was disrupted. And so I see that, like, Dobbs' decision and the way that I talk about this in the chapter as sort of a spatial return of the repressed, the moment that the state then asserts control again over mobility, body, movement, then, Marcuse starts to warn us that that begins to feel like an urgent conversation again. And ultimately that sort of tolerance without critique is complicity. And I'm speaking to Dobbs in that, but I can't help but think, like, again, what we're all speaking to is like how long this project has happened, is to bring it forward. And I would say the same critique that I'm making can be applied to a contemporary conversation right now of, like, what's going on in the States. You mentioned maybe future Supreme Court decisions. That docket's going to be wild again this year, folks. But I really think about it as it relates also to this sort of moment where there's a lot of folks in the United States reckoning with what's happening in Trump 2.0 and really the erosion of a lot of democratic systems, or a lot of the nuance that maybe isn't explicitly laid out, or explicitly laid out sometimes in the Constitution, and how people are wrestling with the fact that, kind of just crumbles so quickly. I think about it as it relates to, there was a recent interview, I don't know if anybody could stomach it, between Ezra Klein and Ta-Nehisi Coates, where, see Jake nodding. It's a long one, folks, but I think it's really interesting. And I'll preface this by saying I'm full Ta-Nehisi stan, so that's where I'm on it. But what they're discussing, Ezra Klein, I think, and a lot of people are grappling with this. I think a lot of white folks, or people that have close proximity to whiteness in this country, are thinking about this question of, like, oh my gosh, suddenly our freedoms are being stripped away, and, like, democracy is changing, and this is so, it's maddening. And I feel that too, right? Like, as a white person who's had a lot of freedoms guaranteed in this country for a long time, I I'm mourning my country as I'm living through this moment. But what Ta-Nehisi Coates is bringing in, and I guess it's a similar thing to what I'm saying, is it's like for a lot of people in this country, the things that you took for granted were never guaranteed for us. And so all of that to say is that I do think that it's an interesting time to bring up this idea of sort of the happy consciousness, the one dimensionality that I'm speaking to in my chapter, and this larger conversation of repressive tolerance that's in the volume. The Marcuse does give us a lens to say, like, those that don't move, that you're not constantly engaged, become flattened. And I think that was absolutely present in this conversation around Dobbs. And for me, it feels even more present now just because of how many other decisions or other conditions have changed, that many of us are suddenly awakening from that sort of dream that we were in.
Very good, very good. Yes, fantastic. And one of the things I noted, right, and this is, I think, again, a very good segue, perhaps for the next thing I'd like to ask Sid about is all of you mentioning race so much, right? And I think, when you think of Marcuse, most people, at least, if you're reading Marcuse, you think, I don't see race in there, right? And of course, that is a big gap. Now, which isn't to say, of course, he wasn't engaged. In fact, he does reference the third world, and in fact, actually, probably more than most other thinkers. But of course, he didn't engage with them, right? I think this is a sort of good shift, right? So, I mentioned, Marcusean topics, that might have seemed dated, entail turning back. Here, I think perhaps we can sort of talk about uh, misconnections, as you all put it, right? The misconnections from the 60s and 70s and onward towards the future use of Marcuse. Specifically, I'm thinking of your article, Sid, on Marcuse and the post-colonial, right? And how we can think Marcuse with these other thinkers that, seem absolutely relevant, off the top of your head. You say, of course, they go together, but, Marcuse never engaged with them, right? So perhaps you could talk a bit about your chapter on that.
Yeah, thanks, Jake. As you said, I wrote this chapter on Marcuse's misconnections with post-colonial thinkers. And I want to say up front, there's this existing academic discourse about whether the Frankfurt School has a colonial problem and whether that problem is like terminal, which I think is important and fine. And Jake, you and I have both engaged in that conversation. Like, that's fine, but that's not exactly what we were doing here, right? Like we said earlier, for this edited volume, it wasn't to be a hagiography of Marcuse, nor was it an indictment. It's not really interested in sort of passing judgment on the guy, right? We were taking what we could from his thinking, and because it seems useful, trying to run with it. And insofar as decades of people from all around the world, including in the global south, have been able to think with Marcuse, why not just do that here, rather than making this about was he enough of an ally back in the 60s or whatever. That's not really what we were interested in. So in that respect, I was like, okay, Marcuse indicated that he was thinking about the third world and about black people in American ghettos. He just sort of said those things in passing, and even saying them in passing is much more than his other Frankfurt School colleagues, could muster. But it's like, okay, so we think that a lot of his problematics are really interesting, important, and international, and he indicates that there are populations that he doesn't spend a lot of time thinking through or with, but that are obviously implicated in the problematics that he is concerned with. So what would it look like to think with him and also other thinkers who are thinking through those problematics, but from a different positionality, right? So I think that thinking with the three thinkers that I bring up in this chapter, Frantz Fanon, Sylvia Wynter, Aimé Césaire, really provide this much more international picture that gives us more vantages on a problem, but from different positionalities, right? Because Marcuse is great, he's doing cool stuff, but he only has a specific positionality, and he can't speak to the experience of colonization in the Caribbean, or he can't speak to the experience of being reified on the basis of the color of his skin, right? He's concerned about those issues, but they're not things that he can speak to, right? And he can't sort of paint that picture for us. So I go through each of these thinkers one by one, trying to set them up in terms of what they can do, or what their thought offers us if we put it in conversation with Marcuse. And the first one is Fanon, and out of Fanon, I take his articulation of colonization as this Manichaean world in which things are broken between the white European world and the black colonized world. And I put that in conversation with Marcuse's conversations about a one-dimensional society. And so like these operate in really, really similar ways. There's this sort of fetishization of European notions of instrumental rationality and progress. But what Fanon gives us is this vantage into how does that intersect with not only the colonial divide, but also just race, right? In a way that Marcuse couldn't speak to. And I think like it's not a question of, do we throw one out and then take up the other, but like both of these vantages are really important in order to understand the construction of that one-dimensional and colonial world, right? Like if we're reading Fanon, it is simultaneously really interesting to understand the psychology of the European who constructs that one-dimensional world. In the same way that if we're reading Marcuse, it's really interesting and useful to know how that world affects people who are not within the bounds of the global north or liberal capitalism, right? The second person I think with is Sylvia Wynter, who points out that like our understanding of the human and reason is like specifically white, European, and male, right? And insofar as Marcuse is really critical of technical rationality in ways that I think are really important and interesting, like those specific accent or those specific like dimensions of technical rationality don't like come up in the same way. And I think that's really important given the prescriptions, right? So Marcuse in Essay on a Liberation is like, we need new humanity and we also need a new conception of reason, right? And it's like, okay, man, what do those look like, right? And like, I understand that, like the like do a lot of drugs and have a lot of sex is like cool and like should be part of it, right? But also it seems like there's other stuff that is really relevant to this question that he doesn't like have his handle on, right? And I think that like looking beyond his vantage point is like absolutely necessary here. And then the final person that I think with is Aimé Césaire, whose discourse on colonialism rocks, and I teach it every year. I feel like every 18-year-old should read it. But just like his conception of fascism as the boomerang of colonialism that's driven by this process of thingification, the reification of people across lines of race and gender, is just like so crucial to understanding of contemporary fascism, not least because like as we look out the window, we see climate colonialism turning into eco-fascism like every day, right? And then when we think about Marcuse's articulation of fascism as like driven by this reification, dehumanization of people, it's like, yeah, like you're right, and that's the articulation that you would give given your positionality as like a white dude in the global north. What would that look like if supplemented by other people who are feeling that reification or thingification from different vantage points? So like all of this leads us to a place in which it's like, okay, Marcuse is like his insights are being supplemented in a really important way, but also we don't want to throw Marcuse out because he's articulating these problematics from within the metropole, right? From within the structures that we're critiquing at the same time. So it's like a, why not both situation? It's why not think with them together? And in that case, like I go back to Angela Davis in the conclusion, in which she says in that speech that was brought up earlier in the hour, where she's just like, Marcuse is only useful to us now if we don't put him on a pedestal, right? Like his thinking is alive and we need to treat it as such, right? And if we're not doing that, then we're failing him and we're failing ourselves, right? And like I'm hoping to put these thinkers in conversation with Marcuse for the sake not of like passing judgment on Marcuse, because I don't really care about that, right? What I care about is addressing these issues, and I think that like his vantage point in conversation with those does get us somewhere that's really helpful.
Very good, very good. It sounds like you're creolizing Marcuse, is that right? And
I would say so.
I say that because perhaps we can take this as as a quick other plug of the other project, specifically creolizing Marcuse that has also recently come out. If one of you would like to talk about that very briefly.
Sure. Yeah. Creolizing Marcuse is part of a series, the Creolizing the Canon series, that is edited by one of my mentors and favorite people in the world, Jane Gordon. And the text is meant to, thank you, Nicole. The text is meant to further some of the themes that occur in the Marcusean mind, but that specifically are looking at the hybridization in both political theory and aesthetics that occurs through the reading together and practicing together the theoretical and scholarly and activist work of Marcuse with folks from the Caribbean and from the African diaspora. And so it activates some of those themes that we cover in the Marcusean mind, but especially moves us toward in the space of the hybridization and creolizing endeavor that many of us in African and Caribbean thought broadly are doing with theory and practice today.
Fantastic. That's great to hear. Um, um, so, um, I think we can sort of start moving towards some, perhaps concluding thoughts. I mean, not yet, right? But I think doing this, and like I said, going back to Marcuse, I think represents a great reaction, especially against, and I think, this has been a big bugbear that I've had, the sort of historical revisionism regarding the Frankfurt School, and I think the lack of historical memory in general, right? We live in 2025. People don't remember 30 years ago, let alone 60 years ago. Uh, I mean, as New Left seemingly fizzled out or exploded, if you want to say, there's this attempt to push Marcuse away. Marcuse was critical theory, and until he wasn't, right? And we've seen the shift, in favor of Adorno, Horkheimer, and of course Habermas. And you push away the Fromm, you push away the Marcuse, you push away the people who are a little inconvenient. And I think for me, this reaches its apex in the sort of renunciation of utopia after the fall of the Soviet Union, right? I mean, even Habermas, in that moment makes a claim, right? Our utopian energies are fizzling out. And of course, history didn't end then. And even if a lot of people forgot about those energies of the 60s and 70s, that doesn't mean that this energy for something else did not. And I think you see this in pathological forms, right? QAnon, Queen Romana, in Canada, right? This hope for, like, in Romana, a literal jubilee of debt, right? And I think even though we say there is no utopic thinking, the fact is utopian energies aren't gone. And so perhaps we could talk about, because it's discussed quite a bit in the text, the sort of importance of the utopic and situated thinking within this topic. So if I leave it to whoever would like to begin.
Yeah, I just add one thing in terms of who theorists are drawn to today and who even students are drawn to is Foucault. I think that Foucault and Marcuse, there was a moment where, we were thinking with both of them, but I think that folks in especially like queer theory and feminist theory have moved towards Foucault and in effect have forgotten and, failed to recognize the value of Marcuse.
Very good.
I think as it relates to this question on utopias, although I think I was not the section editor for this, but I don't know. I've been thinking so much about this, Jake, and others as it relates to some other projects, and I would just say that perhaps something that I think Marcuse offers us, and something that I think is present in the volume, given how much we've talked about sort of the temporalities, the spatial temporalities of when this project started, where Marcuse was writing from, how things have changed, etc., is so much of the idea of utopia has always been presented, or has historically been presented as the sort of destination, as opposed to sort of a horizon. And I think that there is so much good work in the book or in the volume that I would really want to point to, is I think a lot of the ways that our contributors are engaging with this is really fertile to be thinking about, to be integrating into other folks' work. If you go to certain sections of the volume, I would absolutely encourage folks to look at the Utopia section, because what I think Marcuse does well, and something that I've talked about it in terms of this idea of mobility and not getting stuck in sort of a happy consciousness, is or getting stuck in place in time is just this constant need for agitation, this constant need for evaluation of where we are in this moment of time and not feeling settled. And I think there's something really lovely about imagining utopias as a horizon as opposed to destination, and sort of what it takes to constantly engage in that process of reimagining, and actively pursuing questions and criticality, in a way that I suppose on one hand could feel rather not hopeful, because it absolutely is a lot of labor and effort to constantly be moving. But at the same time, I think that in the context of so much, I think we write in the book, like, things feel bad because they are bad, is a line that I forgot who wrote that, but I was like, damn, that's a bar. And sorry that I'm swearing so much on this podcast, but I think, like, when things feel bad, it's really easy to just sort of further entrench oneself and to feel small and to want to just kind of quiet everything out. But in thinking kind of about that horizon, I think there's also something really beautiful that the contributors are speaking to. So I'll stop talking because I wasn't necessarily on that section, but it's one that I'm actually returning to a lot right now. So I really appreciate you bringing up this question, Jake, because I think working towards this horizon both feels really optimistic, but it can also feel really demoralizing at times, because it does require that constant movement that I think Marcuse was really, they were tapped into even when they were writing.
Yeah, I think that's also a very Marcusean question again. As soon as 1975, he already gave this lecture at UC Irvine, which was entitled "The Failure of the New Left?" question mark, in which, like, the question was, why have we failed? Where have we failed? And so on and so forth. So this was only 7 years after 1968, and of course there was, like, the signs of the times were really changing. The 70s, the neo-lib, neocon revolution, and so on and so forth. But Marcuse's reply to that question to me is really interesting, and I still think it's fitting today, which he basically says, well, has the new left really failed? Like, of course, on an operational, organizational, or even strategically level, there are all kinds of failures going around. But if we look at some of the accomplishments that the new left has done, and how that movement, that entire utopian impulses of the 1968 have changed even the face of the left, I wouldn't necessarily call it like a straight out failure. I think some of the questions we have been able to discuss in the last few years really go back to this moment in space and time where we were able to bring out some questions that weren't being asked in the left before that. And I do think that the intensity of the reaction to the other side, like how wild, how crazy, how batshit crazy is the right today about some issues. I think we're striking on nerves there. I think we're really putting the accent in the right directions to be able to discuss these issues. Some of them feel really incremental, really small, sometimes even liberal in scope. But I think in the current situation of capitalism, even this really small, incremental, and sometimes liberal or apparently liberal items of the agenda are not being able to be handled well within a capitalist or bourgeois democratic setting. So I think this goes back to some of the questions that the new left put out are still being discussed today, and it's not necessarily a failure, I think.
Yeah, I would add to that like the historical revisionism with respect to the Frankfurt School just like harms everyone involved, right? Like it's bad and dumb, right? The frame that Marcuse was either a failure or not a failure is itself one-dimensional in a way that's just like sort of frustrating. The all too easy juxtaposition of Marcuse as the activist and Adorno and Horkheimer as a quietist is also not really true or useful. I mean, like Adorno and Horkheimer, much like Marcuse, were writing situated in their historical conditions. And like the eclipse of reason is just like that title alone tells you that they're writing in a moment in which they think that utopia is blocked, but they don't think it's going to be permanent. So they're writing in this way that sounds sort of sad boy and like understandably, but they're not saying it's like that forever, right? So like I just think that even though it is sometimes, I think, like easy in terms of framing devices to juxtapose them in that way, it's not true for either of them. And like their legacies, I mean, much with everyone, like with it's not Freud, it's Freudians. It's not, like it's not Adorno, it's Adornians. It's not Marcuse, it's Marcuse. Well, I mean, we're the Marcuse, so like maybe. But I'll say that like Marcuse's legacy is fascinating, right? Like my wife is finishing up law school. They read the Powell memo that really set up the conservative legal movement in the United States, and the Powell memo mentions one thinker, and it's Herbert fucking Marcuse, right? And they're just like, that's a problem, and we need to put it down, right? And like the reverberations of that, I think are wide, but I don't think that means he was a failure. I think that means that he had his finger on the pulse of something that was super, super important. And like the conditions at that time are different from the conditions at this time, right? Like Marcuse in One Dimensional Man, like in that preface, which I love reading really slowly with my students, where he's just like, two things can be true. It can feel like we're going to be in this shit forever, but also can feel like it's going to fall apart at any moment. That just like feels really helpful right now, especially at a moment in which like the overwhelming presence of capital's realism seems to be fraying, right? Fraying in ways that are complicated, in ways that Nancy Fraser would call an interregnum, right? Like, happy conscience ain't so happy anymore. Consumption isn't the scape that it once was. Pleasure is really weird now. Like, I think that there's this historical moment that's present now that Marcuse speaks to, despite the fact that he was writing back in the 60s and 70s, that is like it there's much that can happen now that ends up getting squashed if we just take on this like historical revisionism of like who was right when all is said and done, right?
Fantastic. Yeah, I was reminded, I think, with all of your comments, it reminded me a little bit of a second cousin of our critical theorist, namely Bloch, who I think it was in his Tübingen address, "Can hope be disappointed?" points out, of course, hope can be disappointed because otherwise it wouldn't be hope, right? And I think we can say the same thing about these sort of utopic energies. So I don't want to keep you all too late. I mean, it's great to see such a volume come out in 2025 and that we continue to see the relevance of Marcuse. Of course, it bears mentioning that we organized this session to coincide, right? It's going to be posted in a few weeks in November. You will see it. Well, obviously, if you're watching this, you know when it was posted. But because of the upcoming 11th Biennial International Herbert Marcuse Society Conference in December, which will be taking place from the 5th to the 7th. Where is that again?
Canada and York University.
Thank you so much. And of course, we had to relocate it for obvious reasons. But thank you all so much for being here. It was a pleasure to talk about the text. As I said, I went through the whole thing with a fine-tooth comb. And yeah, thank you for coming on. And is there anything any of you would like to point people to or anything like that? I guess in podcast parlance, they would say, "Do you have any plugs?" And if I don't hear anything in a second, I'll go, "Yes."
Oh yeah, I have some plugs. So the Marcusean Mind is part of I think a pretty fun series, which is the Philosophical Mind series. And I would be remiss not to shout out something that's coming forward, which a lot of these authors who are now editors on the Fromian Mind were part of our manuscript. And so I think that is coming out possibly in 2026, but please look out for that because I think it's just also another demonstration. We talked a lot about how important collaboration was for us, and a lot of these folks, I think we kind of all met through this Marcuse circle, but it's really great to see other early career and established scholars like supporting each other, building these bridges, and continuing to engage with the Frankfurt School and critical theory. So I would absolutely shout out Fromian Mind. And then I would also just encourage folks to connect at the conference, to reach out to any of us. I'll certainly make myself available, but this also came, as Sid said, as just we met each other, we kind of vibed at a conference and decided to collaborate. And so I think there is not only a historical moment, but just a really rich community of folks in this space, in RPA, et cetera, that are really ready to engage and work together and create spaces of thought and intentionality. So if you have an idea, I would also just say go for it. Because, like, yeah, we've all been working for a couple of years together, but it really was just the product of going to the conference, seeing each other, and what comes next is some exciting volumes.
Yeah, I'd also say, I mean, like, this is the Radical Philosophy Hour, so I'm preaching to the choir here, but like, in the same way that I really enjoyed the Marcuse conference and just sort of made friends and want to go back as often as I'm able to, I had the same experience at RPA. I mean, like, it was great. I met a lot of really cool people. We talked about really important stuff, and it's just a similar site of radical thought and collaboration. So thanks, Jake, and thanks to the RPA.
Yeah, and I'll just add that there's a special issue of Philosophy and Global Affairs coming out this fall, and all of our work in this issue is going to focus on scholar Kursuzi Simeon Jones's work. She's a Black feminist scholar, and her work is on the intellectual history of Black female subjects, in her in the title of one of her books. And so this is a celebration of her work. And so I've been really into celebrating living philosophers, not just celebrating those who are no longer with us, but really promoting the work that we do as scholars and in our disciplines and across disciplines as existing in living archives as well. So if you have never read Kursuzi Simeon Jones's work, check out her books, check out the upcoming issue of Philosophy and Global Affairs.
Yeah, I'll also add that I am finishing editing a special issue of Constelaciones, Revista de Teoría Crítica, is a Madrid-based journal on critical theory, which I very much enjoy reading. It's a very important venue for critical theory for all the Spanish-speaking and Portuguese-speaking communities in the world. And the issue should come out in the next few months. I would say December, January at the latest. And it's focused completely on Marcuse as well. And there are a lot of Spanish speaking, where it's going to be trilingual. It's going to be English, Spanish, and Portuguese. So I very much like to have your feedback and criticism and comments on the issue. And thanks a lot, Jake, for having us here for this opportunity to discuss the book. We worked on this book for, I don't know, 3 years, I think, was it? It was so long in the making. So we're really, really happy to be able to discuss some of the content we put out here. Thanks a lot.
All right.
Yeah, and as Jake pointed out, it's a thick book, so if you need a paperweight or a doorstop or
Yeah.
anything else, it's the book for you.
Yeah, and for our folks too, I would be remiss not to say this because I think this is also really important to us as a team. It is a thick book. It's in its first edition. If price is a concern, but you want to read it, or if you want to engage with it, please shoot us an email. We'd be happy to send our folks who, in this economy, might just need a discounted book. So let us know.
Fantastic. That's so kind of you. Well, again, this is the Radical Philosophy Hour. Thank you all for tuning in. I thank my guests. I thank you. I believe we'll be back in the spring. Obviously the winter months are very busy and people have breaks, but see you in the future. Thank you very much.